David, I am so excited to have you on Peace and Power. Thank you for being with us today.
My honor, Matthew.
I want to start out by asking you a bit about yourself. You have a very interesting background. You grew up in Canada, back when Canada was a country. I'm joking, but you grew up in Canada. Where, when, how, all of the details.
Okay. I'm a native of Ann Arbor, Michigan. I think that's the 49th state, and lived a bunch of places in the US before spending my elementary and high school years in Toronto, Canada, President Trump's 51st state, as you hinted to a
Hmm.
moment ago. I think just an hour ago, the new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, was in the Oval Office meeting with Trump. His election is Trump's fault. Um, there was a conservative leader in Canada who was destined to be the new prime minister, but his campaign was crashed by Trump's threats to annex Canada. But that's another conversation. I moved to Israel almost 35 years ago with my wife and then a baby daughter. Our kids now are all grown. Five of the six are married, and we have a gaggle of grandchildren, thank God. I've been in and out of Israeli government and the think tank world here in Israel since making Aliyah. I served in the prime minister's office for a number of years as Natan Sharansky's senior assistant, and I ran for him something called the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism. I've been part of a series of foreign affairs and defense think tanks, from the Begin Sadat Center at Bar Ilan University to the Herzliya Conference to the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Today I'm at a new think tank, probably the best think tank in Israel, certainly on the conservative side of the map, called the Miskav Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy, and we try to contribute to the defense and diplomatic discourse. The only thing I'll add to that, and to me this is perhaps the most important, I say this with a smile, is that I'm a wine geek, and I've studied winemaking over the last decade at the world's top institute in London. I'm a level 3 accredited sommelier. I write about Israeli and kosher wines around the world, and we should go drink wine together sometime soon.
David, I think you are in the best possible country to be a wine geek. Israel's wines are, well, it's obviously biblically prophesied, the book of Jeremiah and other books. Israel's wines are outstanding. And if you think about a country like France, which has had hundreds of years to cultivate their wines, maybe longer, and Israel's just gotten back in the wine business, what, in the last 40 years, maybe, roughly speaking? It's amazing to see from a wine perspective how Israel's gone from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. It's well, again, we know that there's a biblical meaning for it, but you are absolutely in the right place, and I say that as a former producer of a wine show on public television in America. So,
Yes, I'll add two things about wine. Number one, my all-time favorite biblical verse is the famous verse from Yechezkel, from Ezekiel 36. Vatem hara Yisrael anfachem titenu ufirechem tisau l'ami Yisrael ki kervu lavod. Yechezkel prophesies that the day will come where God will command the mountains of Israel to shoot forth their branches and yield their fruit to my people, to God's people, Israel, for their soon coming home. And that's exactly what's happened in our generation. The land of Israel is giving its magnificent fruit, first and foremost grapes, as well as olives, and other fruits and vegetables, to the land of Israel's indigenous people as the Jewish people returns to the land of Israel. It's 100% biblical. And we all know that Rabbi Abba said in the Talmud that there's no greater sign of revealed sign of redemption than the agricultural reblooming of the end of Israel. Now, I got hit about 2 years ago by Al Jazeera Network, and they didn't like my enthusiastic writing about wine, and they accused me of being drunk on Zion and of wine-washing the occupation. I'm very proud of that. If you go to my website, the tagline is "Drunk on Zion."
Well, I think that's incredibly clever, and I will be going to your website. What's the address for that?
That's davidmweinberg.com.
Okay, and that's not spelled Weinberg Wine, is it?
Correct. It's Weinberg, Weinberg.
Maybe you should change it. You know, it would go with the branding, you know?
Now, who knows where that name Weinberg came from a couple hundred years ago in Europe?
Right. No, that's true. That's a good point. So this could be in your family for a long time. And David, you've actually segued into something interesting to me, and this may be out of left field, but you know, when you're dealing with geopolitics and you're dealing with military actions and covert stuff and diplomacy and that whole world, I think a mistake, and I'd love your reaction to this, I think a mistake that a lot of people make in the wider world is that with Israel, you're not dealing with just any country. You're dealing with a place that God has said is his land. This is the place that he has reserved for himself. And whether you believe in God or not, that doesn't make God's promises untrue. In other words, it was said once by a Christian theologian that I thought it was quite funny. He said, whether you believe the bus is coming or not, if you don't get onto the sidewalk, you're going to get hit by the bus, right? And so using that principle, how do you factor that into your thinking about the state of Israel in the current international climate?
Great question, Matthew. The late, great Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was wont to say that Jews are most respected when they're self-respecting. And I've always taken that to mean the Jews who are conscious of, proud of their heritage, who speak from a deep sense of belief in Jewish history and confidence in God's hand, in providence, guiding the Jewish people back to the land of Israel. Those are the Jews who are most respected around the world. Those are the Jews who can have the greatest impact. Perhaps the greatest failure of Israeli public diplomacy over recent decades, what we call Hasbara, has been the failure to use our biblical heritage and our indigenous rights in the land of Israel, the language of rights, in Israeli diplomacy. You know, Israeli Hasbara, Israeli public diplomacy has for decades focused on Israel's security needs, which is understandable and important. But if you base your argument only on our security needs, we can't afford to withdraw here, we can't afford to withdraw there because we have security needs, we need to control the mountaintops and so on. Ultimately, you're going to lose up against the rights discourse, which the Palestinians have so effectively brandished in their war against Israel. And our legitimacy, ultimately, the self-respect that we demand from the world has to come from a discourse of rights, no less than our adversaries do so. I think that's a very important principle, and I've found that in my own work as well. When you are unapologetic, because you're speaking from a place of faith and confidence in the grand drama of the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel, it works. It speaks to people's hearts.
You know what's interesting, David, and there's so many parallels. You know, we're on a podcast, obviously, about the U.S.-Israel alliance. And when you were saying that, one of the thoughts that I could not escape is that when America is at its best, America talks that way. When you see a president like President Trump's stunning State of the Union address some weeks ago, when America says, hey, we're about God and we're about religious freedom and liberty, and this is why we were established. And, you know, America tells its faith-driven story, which is the true foundation of America, which is why there's such a connective tissue between America and Israel, because they're two countries that were started because their founders wanted to serve God in their way. And people respect America when it speaks strongly this way. And it's amazing when I hear you say that, we think, oh, let's be clever and let's speak in a way that gets our point across. But you're going to have your haters, right? But if you stick to your guns, you're going to earn the respect of so many millions more. And I just think you made a brilliant point about, let's call it Israeli authenticity. This is who we are. This is what we're about. And you see that, and I'd love you to talk about this just for a minute. Since October 7th, we have seen that in our young soldiers here in Israel. There's been a return. People don't know this, but a return to, this is what we're about. We're about God. We're about our land. We're about even the temple. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think most people would be surprised if they saw what was really happening in Israel.
Yeah, this has been building up for about a decade, even before this war, which, as you say, forced Israelis to dig deep into the well springs of Jewish history and identity in order to have the resilience and the faith to go forward in battle. But even before that, if you listen to Israeli music over the last decade or two, pop music, so-called secular music, it's increasingly been infused with words of faith, lyrics drawn from the Bible and from Jewish sources. There are tremendous currents of faith that run through popular Israeli culture today, and music is one example of that, but also in the artistic community and so on.
Yeah.
Now, you may not see that from reading the Israeli papers, which, like most media in Western countries, is overwhelmingly dominated by the secular left that is afraid of and even derisive of the currents of faith and belief that we've just been talking about. But you're right, it came to the fore in this campaign. We have a phenomenon now of many Israeli soldiers, non-religious, not Dati soldiers, asking to wear tzitzit, underneath their uniforms. Maybe it's a little bit kitschy. It's sort of a talisman.
Wait, David, can you stop for our audience that's mostly not Jewish? Can you explain the significance of tzitzit, what they represent, and why soldiers wearing them has meaning?
Tzitzit is a biblical commandment to place a series of strings, ritual fringes on your clothing, and it's generally worn on a square undergarment. Most Orthodox Jews tuck them, into their pants and underneath their shirt. Ultra Orthodox Jews often wear them over your shirt, but you'll see it in the photos of religious Jews with these fringes hanging out. And wearing these fringed undergarments has become a thing among Israeli soldiers. It's a way of connecting to a level of protection from the heavens, almost as if people are saying, "I want to draw down."
So it's almost like representative of a sort of spiritual revival of sorts among the young people in Israel who may have not been sort of spiritually aware, and now they're connected with the ancient Judaism from which we come, and it gives them focus for what they're fighting for. Does that sound correct?
That sounds correct, and yeah. It's a response to the lingering hatreds, these age-old hatreds of vile, vicious, genocidal anti-Semitism that the Jewish people have faced for thousands of years, and we're facing a renewed wave of that coming from the Iranian-backed both Sunni and Shiite radical Islamic movements, which exploded in the Hamas attack, the invasion of southern Israel on October 7, 2023. Sort of as a response to that, Israelis are digging deeper into their age-old ancient faith and saying, yes, we realize, unfortunately, that we are on a long haul. This is not a war that started yesterday. It's not going to be over tomorrow, and we have to have the faith and resilience to fight on.
Okay, so let's get into that war. Israel, just this week, we've seen big U.S. and Israeli strikes against the Houthis. We've seen continued comments about Iran from the president and from others. Can you summarize, David, where you think we are vis-a-vis the quest to ensure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon? Where is the U.S. and Israel alliance on that question right at this moment?
So if we take a 20-month retrospective, Israel is in so much of a better place today than it was 19, 20 months ago, when it was shocked by a massive invasion of southern Israel, which slaughtered 1,200 Israelis on one day. And then we lost another 800 plus soldiers in the subsequent battles, along with 12 to 14,000 Israeli soldiers wounded in battle. 20 months later, thank God, Israel's in a much better place. It has the upper hand. It has begun to restore its turned power. We have pushed back against the Iranian allied radical movements, Hamas in the south, Hezbollah in Lebanon on Israel's north. We've been hitting back at the Iranian-backed proxy, the Houthis in Yemen. Just 3 hours ago, Israel bombed the Houthi airport in Yemen out of existence because the Houthis have been firing long-range ballistic missiles into Israel almost every night, and they attacked Israel's international airport just 2 days ago. Israel is projecting strength again today to definitively neutralize its adversaries, and in so doing to lead the region, to gather a new coalition of truly peace-seeking countries, to truly stabilize the region, and not through hackneyed reliance on diplomatic templates and failed diplomatic formulas that oozed weakness, but rather through a projection of strength. So we're in a much better place today than we were 20 months ago. But the campaign, of course, is not over until Iran's nuclear effort, nuclear military effort, and its ballistic missile array are finished off, either through American diplomacy, which Israelis have great doubts about, or through determined military action. We will not be able to rest. Now, I'll add one more sentence. I assume that listeners of this podcast know that President Trump has authorized a new diplomatic gambit, a series of negotiations with the Iranians. There have been 3 rounds held, the 4th round expected this weekend in Oman. And that's okay with Israel if the purpose of the negotiations is to bring about complete demilitarization, a complete end to the Iranian effort to enrich uranium to nuclear bomb levels, and to fashion a nuclear bomb and mount it on the long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, of which Iran has many, which, by the way, can hit not only Israel, but most of Europe as well. Short of that, anything short of that will not be acceptable to Israel. We cannot afford another what's known as the JCPOA. That was President Obama's deal with the Iranians, which just kicked the can down the road, allowed the Iranians to keep their entire uranium enrichment and bomb-making facilities. Just they couldn't go beyond a certain level, and it was a short-term agreement, most of which is now, coming to an end. No, there needs to be a much more definitive end to Iran's aggressive programs. And I suspect that we're going to have a difficult time. Trump is going to have a difficult time reaching an agreement with the Iranians on this. They've spent 4 decades working on this. They spent billions of dollars. They've suffered many rounds of Western sanctions against their program, and they've persisted nevertheless, which leads me to the conclusion that we'll be moving, most likely be moving to military interdiction of Iran's nuclear programs sometime over the coming year.
Okay, David, as you were talking, 5,427 questions popped into my head. Unfortunately, I don't have time for all the questions I have for you. Let me ask you this one first. There are those in America who feel that Iran may be a threat to Israel, but it's not a threat to the United States. Now, I don't really love the framing of that question, because when you're in an alliance, a threat to one is a threat to another. However, let's just go with that and say, okay, fine. You feel that Iran is a threat to Israel and not a threat to America. What is your response to that assertion?
It's simply not true. A careful review of Iran's foreign affairs and defense policy reveals a very treacherous Iranian record. Iran does not hide its overarching revolutionary ambitions, not only to destroy Israel, but to subdue any pro-Western states, any other pro-Western Arab states in the region, to dominate the region, to export its brand of radical Islamism globally. It not only threatens Israel with destruction and war, it regularly refers to Israel as a cancerous tumor in the Middle East and to the United States as a cancerous tumor on the world stage. Israel is the little Satan and America is the great Satan. And it's seeking to carve out what they call a Shiite land bridge, a corridor stretching from the Arabian Sea all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, where it controls, and it already does control, major parts of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It's equipped its proxies with hundreds of thousands of missiles and rockets in the region. It's acted to foment subversion in Western countries, as well as I said, pro-Western Arab countries. It's sponsored terrorists actions, major terrorist bombings against Western, not just Israeli and Jewish targets around the world. And as I said, it's rapidly approaching full nuclear military status. Now, 6 past U.S. presidents, for all these reasons, 6 past U.S. presidents going way back to Bush and Clinton through Obama and all the way to Trump have all pledged that Iran will never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. Obama's rotten soft deal with Iran complicated things, but it has to be dealt with. And it's a mistake to assume that America can regain its place in the world. Never mind push back against China.
Yeah.
When Iran is acting hegemonically across the region.
Let's get very specific here, David. So walk me through this, okay? Iran gets the bomb, okay? They get nukes. We've talked about what they've done, but let's talk about what they intend to do. So Iran gets the bomb. How's that a problem for America? What specific things is Iran likely to do, given their track record, if they have a nuclear weapons program?
Well, let's start with what Iran says it's going to do. The Iranians don't hide their hegemonic ambitions. They will increase their subversion of Western or pro-Western regimes in the region. They will increase their terrorist activity across the region and extending deep into Europe. They will, their money laundering, cryptocurrency, drug smuggling, and other operations which bring them in millions of dollars will increase, and they will further encroach on Israel's borders. They have proxy groups that they have been funding and building on almost all Israel's borders. The Hamas invasion was only one aspect of that. And they will challenge any Western alliance around the world. Iran is pretty much partnered today with Russia and China in challenging America's interests around the world. Under the cover of a nuclear umbrella, their boldness will only grow. Their aggressiveness will only increase. And that's long before we get to the question of how they would use a nuclear weapon. Would they use a nuclear weapon directly against either American forces in the region or against Jews in the land of Israel?
And I think what I hear among those who are experts like yourself, David, is the concern here is that Iran is different in the sense that
yes,
there are other countries that have nuclear weapons, and the reason they have them is as a deterrent. We're not going to attack, let's say America's not going to attack Russia or China or vice versa, unless you have extreme circumstances because you have mutually assured destruction and nobody wants that. But when you have a regime in Tehran that believes that in the 12th Imam and this idea that they need to bring chaos and calamity to the planet in order to see the fulfillment of prophecy, the concern, and I'm curious about your thoughts, is Iran would actually use a bomb, and not even necessarily as a warhead on a missile, although obviously a possibility. But why not in a terrorist attack in the United States or in other places? In other words, if you've got nukes, you've got different ways to deliver them. What's your reaction to that? Because that seems to be the sort of fear, the deep fear that President Trump has, that Prime Minister Netanyahu has, that the West has in general.
You're absolutely correct. There's a deep flaw in much of Western strategic thinking when it comes to the Middle East. Most Western strategic thinkers, all those who were the experts about the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union, all come from a secular background. And the prisms through which they view strategic affairs are secular ones, meaning states act in their best interests. And in a calculation of interests, you can apply doctrines such as MAD, mutually assured destruction. You can mutually deter each other. The fact is that the Soviet Union and the United States avoided worldwide nuclear war for so many decades. The problem here, as you correctly pointed out, is that there is an apocalyptic, radical Islamic revolutionary zeal that undergirds the entire Islamic state of Iran. They believe that they're going to bring about world cataclysm and a messianic era and the dawn of Islamic ascendancy by bringing about war, nuclear war, and destruction upon Israel first, and then other pro-Western and Western regimes. We cannot discount that apocalyptic revolutionary zeal. We cannot assume that Israel and Iran can coexist for the next 100 years in some sort of coldly calculated mutual deterrence regime. Can't risk that.
David, let me get really specific here. In the event that diplomacy fails, and we hope that it succeeds, or I hope every day that the Iranian people just overthrow the regime. But in the event that we are forced into the worst option, are we looking at a war of limited strikes and taking out the nuclear facilities? Are we looking at an Iraq-style regime change and occupation? What do you what kind of military operation are we looking at?
Okay, I'm going to use your question here to push back against a certain discourse that exists today on the isolationist wing of American foreign policy thinkers, and this is a line of thinking that runs through part or segments of the second Trump administration as well. And that is that America needs to avoid more foreign entanglements, doesn't want to get into more wars, can try to put things to bed through some quickie diplomatic deals, and not get further sucked into confrontation in the Middle East. And in order to advance this way of thinking, they create scare scenarios that an American and Israeli hit on Iran's nuclear facilities would engulf the region in war, would require America eventually to put boots on the ground, and could lead to 50 years of disaster for America. I think that is a wildly and purposefully exaggerated assessment. Iran is a weak country right now. I mean, it's a big country, it's a powerful country, but it's also weak. Its economy is in shambles, having been sanctioned and isolated by America and many Western allies for so long. It has its oil exports going to nowhere in the world except for China, which will buy anything despite Western sanctions. Its people are, I wouldn't say starving, but its people are hurting. The elites, of course, in any dictatorial regime eat well and live well. So the Ayatollahs and their elite circles are doing fine, but there are shortages of everything in Iran, and the regime is increasingly finding it difficult to clamp down on internal dissent and protests. A well-timed and focused strike that decimates Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile arrays, that chokes off its only source of foreign dollars of income, which is the sale of oil, would push back sufficiently against the Iranians, and could lead to regime change without drawing the entire region into broader war. And those who, like the American broadcaster Tucker Carlson, who every day say, oh my God, the hawks are going to push us into war and we're going to have American boots on the ground, they're doing a disservice to the American people. That's not the likely scenario.
David, is in a strike on Iran, is America even involved, or is this a situation where the president gives Israel's Air Force the go-ahead and that's the end of it? The president alluded to that a few weeks ago on Twitter. He said that any strike on Iran would be led by Israel. Can you put a little bit more meat on those bones?
We're speculating here, but I think the most likely scenario is that Israel will begin doing the job of crushing Iran's nuclear military apparatus. It'll start the job of destroying Iran's frontline nuclear and missile bases, and Washington will kick in with auxiliary offensive and defensive moves to back up Israel and demonstrate to Tehran that its hegemonic gig is up. Now, if Iran is stupid enough to make good on its threats, to retaliate by lashing out at Israel and U.S. troops and facilities across the Arabian Gulf and at American allies in the region, then Trump will have no choice but to unleash America's military might against Iran too. And yes, there are some nasty wags who in that scenario will accuse Israel of dragging America into war, but so be it. In the absence of Iranian nuclear capitulation to the U.S., there will be no choice. I think that's the most responsible and likely scenario. I'm not sure that can be avoided. Now, if Trump is powerful enough to bring about a complete dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear and missile programs through the force of his personality and his, Godspeed. I find that unlikely.
David, you gave this whole thing a timeline of a year. Can you tell us why? Where did you get that timeline from?
The timeline is a function of two things. Number one, it's the international assessment, the International Atomic Agency, the IAEA.
Yeah,
Yeah,
now we're gonna get lost in alphabet soup.
yeah. Uh,
International, yeah,
all nuclear, yeah, all
IAEA. Yeah.
nuclear inspectors and agencies have
Yes.
said that Iran is 95% of the way towards completing the fuel cycle and the bomb making cycle. It could go full nuclear cycle and launch and test nuclear weapons in as little as 2 weeks. They're that close. They are essentially a nuclear threshold state. So there's not a lot of time. That's number one. And number two, in a recent strike, a response to Iranian missile strikes directly on Israel, Israel struck out, lashed out, and destroyed the entire Iranian air defense system. A sophisticated air defense system called the S-300 and S-400 missile system supplied to Iran by Russia. Israel took out those air defenses. Iran is naked at the moment. There's a window of opportunity now that probably will not return and needs to be taken advantage of.
Okay, David. So with all this, what do you see as, so we've talked about a world in which Iran has the bomb. Let's talk about a world in which Iran does not have the bomb. What does that world look like for America and for Israel?
It's a world where the Abraham Accords expand, where the peace treaty signed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco and Sudan of 4 or 5 years ago, this is from in the first Trump administration, grow to include other countries in the region, ranging from Indonesia in Asia, the largest Muslim country in the world, to a half dozen other Muslim and Arab countries in the Middle East and in Africa. It's a world in which partnership with Israel in the West grows, prosperity comes to the region. The irony here is that all this is based on Israeli strength. Countries such as the countries I just mentioned, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, rushed to partner with Israel because they viewed Israel as strong. They viewed Israel as militarily strong. Israel's a strong economy. It's a powerful, high-tech leader in the world. And because Israeli society is strong, it's the society of faith and resilience that we talked about earlier. And all this is so attractive to countries in the region. You know, I've been to the Emirates, United Arab Emirates, 6 times now. I have friends and colleagues there in their foreign policy and defense community. And it amazed me from day one. It still amazes me that what they find most attractive about Israel is all the things I talked about beforehand, but the strength and the resilience and the faith of Israeli society, because that's what they want for themselves. They want to take the Arab world out of the medieval ages. They want to embrace Western science and technology and education while remaining relatively traditional societies that are proud of their faith, proud of their traditions, very proud of their ethnicity. The Emiratis are the best example of that. They see Israel as a role model. In my mind, that's from Zion, Torah shall go forth, as the Bible says. They view Israel as a role model in so many ways. And yes, the Middle East will be catapulted to much better places. What's the problem? Problem is that there are some in the Western world, including some of our so-called Western European allies and allies on the democratic side of the map in the United States, who are uncomfortable with Israel being so strong. They almost want to keep Israel weak. They want to push Israel back to the 67 borders. They want Israel to go back to the old models of diplomatic concessions. They want Israel to be restrained, constrained, hemmed in, humbled. You hear this, for example, from President Macron of France, who says that Israel has the right, quote unquote, to defend itself, but within proportions. In other words, Israel sort of it has the right to intercept incoming missiles, but not to go on ground offenses to crush Iranian proxies that are on our border. And you see that in some articles in the New York Times as well, that we need to come to a better symmetry of power in the Middle East. These are some of the language that's used, which is what's the word? It's a whatever it is. It's old liberal Western thinking that is blind to the jihadist nature of Israel's enemies, blind to the threat of the jihadis to the other nations in the region that we've talked about, blind to the jihadi-minded migrant populations that have been coming to the West. Canada is an example of that. But Israel's not going back there. Israel has come to, as I said, beginning of our conversation, a much better balance between diplomacy and the use of force to prevent and scuttle enemy threats and to draw the lines of new partnerships in the region. Israel needs to be feared. It does need to be dominant, not just loved. And it knows that its enemies will seek true partnership with Israel only when it's strong. And those who stoop to demonizing Israel as the threat, those who seek to constrain Israel, to weaken Israel, are doing themselves a favor. They're doing all peoples in the Middle East an enormous disfavor.
David, let's end where we started. When you look at everything that's happening and everything that you see, and you think about the Bible and what the Bible has to say, I'm curious what comes to mind about what the Bible has to say about this moment and about what you were just talking about with regard to Israel being strong. Can you wax rabbinical for us on us for a minute and tell us God's perspective on this?
My greatest concern is none of the things that we've discussed up until now. Strategy, diplomacy, military, Iranian threats, the jihadi hegemonic moves against Israel and against the West in general. My greatest concern, we will handle all of those. We have to. My greatest threat is my greatest concern is the tone of debate in Israel and the character of Israeli society. We've become a very divided and angry people. People are hurting. People are still hurting from the Hamas assault of 19, 20 months ago. Naturally, many Israelis blame the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, this current Netanyahu government, and previous Netanyahu governments. And there's a hankering for new leadership, as you probably know, as many of our listeners know. Israel has been riven by internal protests and demonstrations nonstop now for over 2 years. And in some parts of Israeli society, there's a debilitating discourse of depression, of decay, with a lot of anger built in. And that is. But there's a different discourse. There's an Israeli discourse, as we talked about earlier, of determination, of defiance, of destiny, and that's the discourse that needs to be augmented. Israelis themselves need to find new anchors for their unity. The biblical prophets that you just referenced, that's what they talk about, that Israel will succeed. And it will succeed in all ways, economically and agriculturally, and in its defense, when the people of Israel do justice in their own society, when they care for the poor, for the widows, for the orphans, and when they treat each other with respect. And There's a real struggle underway here inside Israel today to ensure a more elevated, respectful, discourse, one that is marked by brotherly love, not just bitterness, anger, and resentment. That is our greatest challenge. Our greatest challenge is coming together to face all the external difficulties we talked about earlier. Israel will be going to a national election within a year. Perhaps that also gives us some explanation for the 1-year timeline that I put on things earlier. And we need to go into national elections with a set of ground rules that ensure that we have a respectful election that is both fierce in its authenticity, but also one marked by internal respect and brotherly love. That's something we're going to have to work on a lot.
Well, this is something, again, we're talking about the U.S.-Israel alliance, and this is something that America and Israel share in common. And a
breakdown of internal discourse and
we need a restoration of civility, and that's also biblical because civility equals respect, and disrespect and disregard for civility. There's society is called civil society for a reason, right? So
the poisoning of political discourse that you're right, we've seen in America in recent years, and that we've seen in the last while in Israel as well, that's the real strategic threat.
Yeah, that's right. David Weinberg, thank you for your time. Thank you for enlightening us today. We appreciate it and absolutely want to have you back as this develops.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to get to know you, and I'm happy to speak to you and your many listeners. More power to you, more power to Israel, more power to America.
Thank you, David.